In this environment marathon, we discussed two chapters, that is water and water related governance, and climate, climate governance, climate finance, etc. Now we are going to discuss the chapter number 3, that is environmental governance, that is environmental impact assessment, carrying capacity, and laws. In this environmental governance, we are going to discuss why this is chapter is a guaranteed hotspot for MAINS 2026. Here, chapter 2 mapped the damage, depleting aquifers, and dying wetlands, salinizing coasts, and a project like Great Nicobar sitting on a fragile island. So, this chapter is about the machinery meant to prevent the damage and why it keeps failing. So, environmental governance is one of the most tested zones in this paper. So, we are going to discuss environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment and project regulation appeared in 2013, 2014, 2016, 2019, and 2020 and 2024. Six times, six of the last 12 years. That is not a theme you can skip. And note the exact shift in what UPSC wants. Older question asked you to describe the EIA processes, that is environment impact assessment. The 2024 question asked you to name 4 real NGO interventions with details. So the demand moved from explain the regulation to show me you know how it actually plays out with evidence. So you have to prepare accordingly. This chapter is built around named cases and precise mechanisms. Here, what is the spine and the spine applied to governance? Our three question spine reframes this entire chapter. First one, what damage? Projects clearing ecosystems, displacing communities, exceeding what the land can bear. And the second one, in our spine, that is why is government failing? Weak appraisal, captured consultants, absent monitoring, exemptions, retrospective clearance. And third one in the spine, that is what remedy? Genuine cumulative assessment, real public participation, post clearance monitoring, carrying capacity limits. And here is the single most important line for this whole chapter, the thesis that scores across every governance question, that is India's environmental problem is not the absence of laws, it is the failure of implementation. India's environmental problem is not the absence of laws, it is the failure of implementation. We have robust statutes. What we lack is appraisal quality, monitoring, and enforcement. You can say that, prove it, and you have the examiner's frame. So, what exactly environment impact assessment is and why it matters? We have to fix the concept precisely because precision is what this chapter rewards. Environmental impact assessment is anticipatory governance. Anticipatory governance. It is the tool that evaluates a project's environmental consequences before it is approved. So the damage is prevented, not compensated after the fact. It embodies the precautionary principle where there is risk of serious harm, act to prevent it rather than wait for proof. So the EIA process has 4 stages. What are the 4 stages? First one, screening, scoping, public consultation, and appraisal. Four stages. And comes to the screening. What is the screening here? Does the project need assessment? Then comes to scoping. What impacts must be studied? Public consultation. The affected communities hearing and appraisal, expert evaluation before clearance. These are the four stages in the impact assessment, environment impact assessment. So here, what is the legal architecture? Impact assessment was institutionalized through the EIA notification of 1994, replaced by the EIA notification of 2006, issued under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. So the framing that scores is environmental clearance is not a procedural formality. It is an instrument of anticipatory governance. The average answer treats EIA as bureaucratic step, but top answer treats it as the operational form of the precautionary principle. This is not a bureaucratic step. This is operational form of the precautionary principle. So, where EIA actually fails, where EIA actually fails. Now, the second question is, why is the machinery failing? This is the analytical core, and each failure is a scoring point. Poor quality impact assessments, reports that understate impact, the interest, the consultation conflict of interest. The EIA report is commissioned and paid for the project proponent, so the assessor's incentive is to clear, not to scrutinize. Then inadequate cumulative impact assessment. Each project judged in isolation. So 10 individually acceptable projects is one valley added up to the load of the ecosystem cannot bear. So weak public hearings cannot weak public hearings. Consultations reduced to formality or bypassed. Post clearance monitoring failure. The single biggest gap, conditions are imposed to clearance, then never checked, and dilution through exemptions, categories of projects removed from scrutiny entirely. So here where it fails, the first one is consultant to proponent conflict of interest. Then second one, no cumulative impact assessment. Then third one, weak and bypassed public hearings. And fourth one, post clearance monitoring. This is the biggest gap. So the environmental impact assessment in India suffers more from weak appraisal and absent post clearance monitoring than from any absence of regulation. The consultant proponent conflict of interest and the neglect of cumulative impact hollow out an otherwise sound anticipatory framework we have. So I'm repeating again, why actually, where EIA actually fails, and why is the machinery failing. So this is analytical core, and each failure is a score point. First and foremost, that is poor quality impact assessments. Poor quality impact assessments. Under the poor quality impact assessments, reports that understate impact. Reports that understate impact. The consultant conflict of interest. Under the consultant conflict of interest, the EIA report is commissioned and paid for by the project proponent. So the assessor's incentive is to clear, not to scrutinize. Inadequate inadequate cumulative impact assessment. Inadequate cumulative impact assessment. Each project judged in isolation. So 10 individual acceptable projects in one valley add up to a load the ecosystem cannot bear. Weak public hearings. Under the weak public hearings, consultations reduced to formality or bypassed. Then comes to the post clearance monitoring failure. Under the post clearance monitoring failure, the single biggest gap is this: conditions are imposed at clearance. Conditions conditions are imposed at clearance, then never checked. And dilutions through exemptions, categories of projects removed from scrutiny entirely. So these are the things for failing these environmental impact assessment. So environmental impact assessment in India suffers more from weak appraisal and absent post clearance monitoring than from any absence of regulation. So the consultant proponent conflict of interest and the neglect of cumulative impact hollow out an otherwise sound anticipatory framework. So comes to the PYQ corner. How does the draft EIA notification 2020 differ from the EIA notification 2006? This question asked in 2020 for 10 marker question. The 2020 drafts most criticized fears: post-facto clearance, reduced public consultation windows, more exempted categories are exactly the failures above, which is why it due protest. Then we are moving to next scene, that is the ex-post-facto clearance debate. What exactly the ex-post-facto clearance debate? Here is the sharpest live debate in environmental governance and a strong 2026 possibility, because it pits two principles directly against each other. Exposed facto clearance, exposed facto clearance means granting environmental clearance after a project. Exposed facto clearance means granting environmental clearance after a project has already been built or began operating. Retrospective regulation of a violation. So, the case against it is rooted in principle. Prior clearance is the very heart of the precautionary principle. Approves first, act second. Then comes to the retrospective clearance, inverts that. It rewards those who build illegally because damage may already be irreversible by the time appraisal happens. It weakens the rule of law and the Article 21 right to a healthy environment. So ex post facto clearance means what? Granting environmental clearance after a project, after a project has already been built, has already been built or begin operating, begin operating retrospective regulation of a violation. So the case against is it is rooted in principle. The case against it is rooted in principle. What is that principle? Prior clearance is the very heart of the precautionary principle, then approves first and act second. Comes to the retrospective clearance, inverts that. That is act first and approve next. It rewards those who build illegally because damage may already be irreversible by the time appraisal happens. It weakens the rule of law and the Article 21 right to a healthy environment. So what is the case for flexibly? It's pragmatic. Demolishing a complete public asset, a hospital, a highway, a plant, imposes enormous social and economic cost, punishing the public for a proponent's procedural lapse. So comes to the balanced and scoring up position. Ex post facto clearance must never become routine where it is unavoidable. It must carry deterrent penalties, mandatory restoration, environmental compensation, restoration bonds, public disclosure, and independent monitoring, so that regularization is costly, not a cheap escape from prior compliance. So, exposed to facto environmental clearance creates a conflict between the rule of law and the developmental pragmatism. So, the resolution is not to ban it absolutely, not to normalize it, but to make regularization exceptional and expensive, never a substitute for prior clearance. This is the exposed facto clearance we discussed. Rule of law, rule of law versus developmental pragmatism. The case against his prior clearance, heart of a precautionary principle, then rewards those who build illegally. Damage may be irreversible before appraisal, then weakens rule of law under Article 21. Then comes to pragmatism case for demolishing completed public assets is costly, punishes public for proponents lapse, some flexible genuinely needed, but never as a routine. So make regularization exceptional and expensive. Deterrent penalties, restoration bonds, disclosure, independent monitoring is needed. Then comes to the next scene, that is carrying capacity and cumulative impact. What is carrying capacity and cumulative impact? Now the concept, the 29 question tested, and it connects directly to chapter second, so Great Nicobar. Carrying capacity. What is carrying capacity? Carrying capacity is the maximum load, the population, the activity, the extraction that an ecosystem can sustain without degrading. That is called as carrying capacity. If exceed it, and the system tips from stress to damaged. So the governance failure is that India clears project one at a time, but ecosystems experience them all at once. In a fragile Himalayan valley or a small island, each dam, road, or hotel may pass its individual environmental impact assessment, while the cumulative load shatters the carrying capacity of the whole landscape. This is why the reform demand is a shift from project wise clearance to cumulative and carrying capacity based assessment, and in especially fragile regions, to strategic environmental assessment, which evaluates whole region or sectors plan, not just one project inside it. So this is why the reform demand is a shift from project wise clearance to cumulative, cumulative and carrying capacity based assessment, and in especially fragile regions to strategic environmental assessment, which evaluates a whole region or sector's plan, not just one project inside it. So this is the need, strategic environmental assessment, which evaluates a whole region or sector's plans, not just a project inside it. So project wise environmental clearance is inadequate in ecologically fragile regions where cumulative impacts exceed the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. Carrying capacity based on strategic environmental assessment must replace atomized project by project appraisal. Then comes to the PYQ question. Define carrying capacity as relevant to an environment and explain how understanding it is vital for sustainable regional planning. This question asked in 2019 15 marker question. The 2026 upgrade fuses with fuses this with cumulative impact and a fragile region planning. So this is the thing. Then comes to the next scene, that is case study bank, NGOs, activists and the courts. Now the scene what win what wins or losses the 2024 style question. The 2024 paper demanded four specific examples with all important details. So generic statements last half the marks. So commit these to memory, each one a real instance of civil society or the judiciary reshaping an environmental outcome. The first one is Silent Valley, Kerala. A sustained public and scientific campaign in the late 1970s and 80s halted a hydroelectric project, saving one of India's last undisturbed tropical rainforests. The temple for citizen-led conservation. Then comes to second one, Niyamgiri, Odisha. Vedanta, the Supreme Court empowered the local Gram Sabha to decide on bauxite mining in the Niyamgiri Hills. The Dongria Kond tribe voted no. The Dongria Kond tribe voted no. The project was blocked. The landmark case for community consent and Forest Rights Act protection. So then third one, Sterlite Tuticorin. Sustained local protest against a copper smelter's pollution, culminating in the plant's closure. The case of community action against industrial contamination. Then fourth one is Chardham Highway. Environmental petitions over slope cutting and Himalayan fragility forced judicial scrutiny off-road width and cumulative impact in an ecologically sensitive zone, directly linking activism to the carrying capacity argument from SEN 6. So this is all case study banks 2024 asked. So four named cases, each with a mechanism. Silent Valley, Citizen Science Campaign, then Niyamgiri, Gram Sabha Consent, Sterlite, Community Action on Pollution, Chardham, Judicial Review of Fragile Zone Impact. So naming these with specific outcome is exactly what the 2024 question rewarded. What role do environmental NGOs and activists play in influencing environmental impact assessment outcomes for major projects in India? Cite four examples with all important details. This is 2024 question asked for 10 markers. Not optional detail. The instruction was explicit in the question. That is four examples with details. So then we are moving to closing closing scene. That is, the environment impact assessment is anticipatory governance, the precautionary principle in operational form, but it fails at appraisal quality, cumulative assessment, cumulative assessment, and post clearance monitoring, post clearance monitoring. Ex-Post-Facto clearance pits rule of law against pragmatism. Ex-Post-Facto clearance pits rule of law against pragmatism, resolved by making regularization exceptional and expensive. Carrying capacity demands we judge projects together, not one at a time. And civil society and the courts, Silent Valley, Niyamgiri, Sterlite, Chardham, have repeatedly done the scrutiny the formal system failed to. The thesis holds throughout that not the absence of law, but the failure of implementation. But the failure of implementation. In segment 2, we go to the law itself, the constitutional foundations, the environmental principles, the National Green Tribunal, and the wave of 2025 reforms reshaping how India regulates its environment. The constitutional foundation sector, that is segment 1, showed how project governance fails in practice. Segment 2 goes to the legal foundation beneath it. And this is where precise citation ends marks a vague answer never will. So India's environmental law rests on three constitutional pillars. First one, Article 21. Article 21, the right to life, read by the courts to include the right to clean and healthy environment. This is the anchor for Article 21. And then comes to the second one, that is Article 48A. This is a direct principle, directs the state to protect and improve the environment. And Article 51A Class G, a fundamental duty places the same obligation on every citizen. So the Constitution frames environment as a shared duty, a right for the individual, a duty for the state, a duty for the citizen, and layered on top are the environmental principles the judiciary has woven in. Principles that strengthen almost any answer in this paper. The precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, sustainable development, absolute liability, the public trust doctrine. That natural resources are held by the state in trust for the people, and integration, intergenerational equity, that we hold the environment in trust for those not yet born. So, name the exact article and the exact principle in the answers. Environmental protection under Article 21, reinforced by Article 48A and 51A Clause G, scores where the Constitution protects the environment does not. Precision is the currency of a governance answer as far as GS3 environment is concerned. The evolution of environmental law. Now place the statutes on a timeline because the trajectory itself tells a story the examiner rewards a shift in the style of regulation. 1972, the Stockholm Declaration. The Stockholm Declaration, the global trigger for India's environmental lawmaking. 1974, the Water Act, India's first major pollution statute. It created pollution control boards. 1981, the Air Act. 1984, the Bhopal gas tragedy, the catastrophe that forced the next leap. 1986, the Environmental Protection Act, the umbrella law giving the center sweeping power to regulate pollution and issue rules and notification. 1994 and 2006, the environmental impact assessment notifications, institutionalizing anticipatory clearance. 2010, the National Green Tribunal formation. 2012, perform, achieve, and trade. The first market-based mechanism comes to 2023, the carbon credit trading scheme, that is CCTS. So read the sequence and you see the trajectory. From command and control, the state prescribes standards and policies, them then toward market based, and most recently risk based, trust based governance. That evolution is the frame for everything in this segment. This is the evolution. Principles, precautionary polluter space. Okay, then we're moving to National Green Tribunal. The NGT deserves its own scene because UPSC tests both its power and its limits. Established in 2010, the National Green Tribunal is specialized interdisciplinary environmental court. Judges sit alongside environmental experts. It delivers relief compensation and restitution, applies the polluter pays and precautionary principles, and runs on a natural justice based procedure rather than rigid civil rules, making environmental justice faster and more accessible. comes to the name, but name its limits also, because that is the analytical half. The NGT's jurisdiction excludes three major statutes: the Wildlife Protection Act, the Indian Forest Act, and the Forest Rights Act. So a whole domain of forest and wildlife disputes falls outside its reach, and it faces enforcement challenges. Orders passed are not always implemented. This is the enforcement challenges faced by NGT. The balanced NGT answer holds both halves: a genuine institutional innovation for accessible environmental justice, constrained by jurisdictional exclusions and a weak enforcement of its own orders. So this is all regarding about National Green Tribunal (NGT). So comes to the 2025 reform wave. What is the reforms in 2025 toward trust-based governance? Now the most current material in the chapter, that is, and almost no competitors notes have it. Through 2025, India pushed a wave of reforms, shifting environmental regulation from command and control to risk-based, trust-based governance. Walk through them because each is a fresh citable development. From command and control to risk-based, trust-based governance. Risk-based, risk-based, and trust-based governance from command and control. So what are the developments? Parivesh 3.0. What is Parivesh? A nationwide single window digital platform for environmental clearances and post approval compliance monitoring with integrated baseline data and AI enabled support. It directly targets the appraisal and monitoring failures from segment 1. The environment audit rules 2025, introducing certified third party environmental auditors, outsourcing verification to accredited professionals to strengthen compliance while easing the regulators' burden. The industry reclassification: red, orange, green, white, and a new blue category for units providing essential providing essential environmental services such as compressed biogas plants, given an extended consent validity. 2025 environmental reforms, that is Parivesh 3.0, single window clearance plus AI enabled post approval monitoring. Comes to environmental audit rules 2025, certified third party auditors, new blue industry category, essential environmental services, new blue industry category, that is essential environmental services. Example example, CBG plants, green belt norms rationalized in October 2025, proportional to pollution potential, replacing the blanket 33% requirement. These are the rules. And next we are going to next scene, that is 13, Janavishwas, decriminalization and its debate. One 2025 reform deserves a scene of its own because it cuts both ways and a two-sided answer scores. Through the Jan Vishwas framework, the government decriminalized minor offences under key environmental statutes: the Environment Protection Act, the Air Act, the Indian Forest Act, and via Article 252, the Water Act, replacing imprisonment with monetary penalties for lesser violations. Alongside it, the relief for a death in an industrial accident was raised from 25,000 rupees to 5 lakh rupees. And an environmental relief fund of 1100 crore was made available for the remediation of contaminated sites. What is the debate now? Now the debate is hold both sides, that is the case for and the case against. The case for is it eases business, unclogs courts of trivial cases, and channels penalties toward actual ecological restoration rather than symbolic prosecution. Comes to the case against. Decriminalization can weaken deterrence. A monetary penalty can become a license to pollute for a firm that can simply absorb the cost, and without careful valuation of ecological damage, fines may fall short of the harm done. The shift to trust base, the shift to trust based environmental governance, decriminalization, third party audit, single window clearance can reduce compliance burden and channel penalties toward restoration, but risks weakening deterrence unless penalties are calibrated to the ecological damage, and post clearance monitoring is genuinely strengthened. This two side line is the scoring position on the entire 2025 reform wave. This is regarding 2025 reforms, Parivesh 3.0, Environmental Audit Rules 2025, the new blue industry category, and Genvish was 25 to 5 lakh, 25K to 5 lakh, 1100 crore relief fund, case compliance and funds restoration, but a penalty can a license to pollute. So the next scene is the state evidence, growth and green together. Close the analytical arc with proof that two goals need not conflict. Useful for any environment versus ease of doing business question. Several states show that regulatory predict several states show that regulatory predictability and sustainability can advance together. Tamil Nadu runs common effluent treatment plants for clusters of small polluting units, tanneries, textiles. So, so even small farms meet discharge standards. Then Kerala has pursued carbon neutral gram panchayats alongside streamlined clearances. Then Andhra Pradesh built an online consent management system that cut delays while improving transparency between industry and the pollution board. The lesson here is the binding constraints on good environmental governance are not the laws themselves, but regulatory predictability, administrative capacity, and the adoption of technology, which returns us the chapter's thesis. And comes to the close the governance chapter is here. We begin with environment impact assessment as anticipatory governance, failing at appraisal, cumulative assessment and monitoring, the Ex-Post-Facto debate, carrying capacity, and the civil society cases that did the scrutiny the system missed. We built the legal foundation, Article 21, 48A, 51A, Class G, the environmental principles, the statutory timeline from Stockholm to CCTS, and the NGT with its innovation and its exclusions. And we closed on the 2025 reform wave that Parivesh 3.0, environment audit rules, the blue category, and Gen Vishwas, a decisive shift toward risk-based, trust-based governance. Powerful, but only as a good as the deterrence and monitoring behind it. One thesis carried the whole chapter here is that is India's environmental challenge is not the absence of law, it is the failure of implementation. Run it through the spine. What is the spine that is here? The damage, projects clearing ecosystem behind carrying capacity, governance failure, weak appraisal, absent monitoring, exclusions, under deterrence. Then what is the remedy? Cumulative assessment, real participation, calibrated penalties, and tech enabled monitoring. So governance is not absence of law, failure of implementation, failure of implementation. Projects clearing ecosystems beyond carrying capacity, weak appraisal, absent monitoring, exclusions, under deterrence, cumulative assessment, real participation, calibrated penalties, technology enabled monitoring. Then chapter 4 takes the next theme where implementation is the whole story, that is pollution and waste. The air we breathe, and the mountains of waste we generate. That is chapter number 4, pollution and waste, air, plastics, circular economy. So, in this, we are going to discuss segment 1, that is air pollution and NCAP. Why pollution is an implementation story? Why? Chapter 3 closed on a thesis, not the absence of law, but the failure of implementation. Pollution and waste are where that thesis is the entire story. We have the standards, we have the schemes, yet Indian cities top the world's most polluted list. And our waste piles into mountains taller than buildings. This chapter is about the gap between rule and reality. And the timing is exam perfect. Air pollution was last tested directly in 2020, 2021, 2022, then a 4-year gap. The National Clean Air Program reaches its target deadline in 2025, 2026. The exam year itself. Solid waste was last tested in 2018. Overdue, it is overdue. And the solid waste management rules 2026 were just notified. Both halves of this chapter sit on a fresh examinal ground. What is the spine applied to this pollution? First one, water damage. Air that shortens lives, waste the poisons underwater. Second one, why governance failing? City bound plans against airborne pollution, collect and dump against mounting waste, weak segregation, weak enforcement. The third one is water remedy, airshed governance, circular economy, sources segregation, procedure, producer responsibility. And note that vocabulary shift this chapter demands most sharply from control to circularity and resource recovery. The old frame here is collect the waste, disperse the pollution, and dispose. The new frame here is recover the resource, close the loop, prevent it source. Then comes to the next scene, that is air pollution as a multidimensional crisis. Frame air pollution correctly because it is not one problem, it is four. It is an environmental crisis, first one. Environmental crisis, public health crisis, economic crisis, and justice crisis. So first one is environmental crisis, four dimensional crisis, and the smog mechanism. Environmental crisis, degraded air, damaged ecosystems. It is a public health emergency. India carries one of the world's highest burden of pollution linked respiratory, cardiovascular, and premature death. It is a productivity loss, lost work days, lower cognitive and economic output, and it is a social justice issue. The closest to poor live closest to industry and roads, work outdoors in the worst air, and can least afford protection. The sources are diverse, and the diversity is the whole governance problem. Transport, industry, and power plants, construction and road dust. The sources, what are the sources for this here? The sources are diverse for air pollution. The diversity is whole the governance problem. Transport, industry and power plants, construction and road dust, biomass and household fuels, crops residue burning, waste burning, and critically regional atmospheric transport to pollution that crosses city and state boundaries on the wind. So frame air pollution as a four-dimensional crisis: environmental, health, economic, and justice. So not merely an environmental one. That breadth is what a 15 marker rewards. What is the mechanism? The mechanism photochemical smog. 2022 tested this directly and a named chemical mechanism scores where a description cannot. So what is photochemical smog? Photochemical smog forms not from smoke. but from sunlight acting on pollutants. What is the recipe here? Oxides of nitrogen plus volatile organic compounds plus sunlight react to produce ground level ozone and peroxyacetyl nitrate or PAN. Write it as the equation, that is NOx plus VOCs plus sunlight, that is gives rise to O3 plus PAN. This is the photochemical smog and mechanism. The nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds come mainly from vehicles and industry. The sunlight is the catalyst, which is why photochemical smog peaks on hot, sunny, traffic heavy days, not cold ones. What are the effects of this photochemical smog? Eye and respiratory irritation, reduced lung function, crop damage, and reduced visibility. The international frame, the question paired it with. What is that? The 1999 Gothenburg Protocol under the UNECE Convention on Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution, which set national emission ceilings for very pollutants that drive smog, that is sulfur, nitrogen oxides, volatile compounds, and ammonia, etc. Comes to the PYQ corner. Discuss in detail the photochemical smog, emphasizing its formation, effects, and mitigation. This is the question PYQ asked in 2022. For the answer, you have to explain the 1999 Gothenburg Protocol. Then formation is the chemical mechanism, name NOx plus VOCs plus sunlight gives rise to O3 plus PAN, and you have the marks. This is the way you have to write an answer. In the mains examination, marks is important, writing an answer is most important. So next scene, that is NCAP, its deadline year. This is the anchor development of the segment and one of the most probable questions in the paper, because the program's clock runs out in the exam year. The National Clean Air Program launched in January 2019, covering 131 non-attainment and a million cities across 24 states and union territories. Baseline year is 2017-18. Target was revised to a reduction of up to 40% in PM10 or attainment of standards by 2025-2026. City specific annual targets of 3 to 15%, 82 cities under NCAP, plus 49 under the 15th Finance Commission Air Quality Grant. Monitoring runs through the PRANA portal. Comes to the scoring part, the government versus audit contrast. Do not report only the official picture. Set the claim against the independent audit. So NCPA deadline, independent assessment CREA 2026, of 100 NCAP cities with adequate data, only 51 hit the initial 20 to 30% target. Just 23 achieved the revised 40% target. 23 cities recorded an increase in PM10, then 77 cities reported reductions, but 68 of them still exceed the national air quality standard. Delhi remains the most polluted annual PM10 particulate matter 10, around 197 micrograms per meters microgram per meter cube. So 28 of the 131 cities still lack continuous monitoring stations. So as NCAP reaches its 2025-26 milestones, the gap between reported and audited progress is itself the story. A minority of cities met the revised target, and most that improved still breach the national standard, pointing to the need for legally binding targets and a shift from PM10 to the more harmful PM2.5. So PYQ, NCAP tested, that is question, who air quality guidelines versus NCAP tested 2021 with the deadline falling in 2026. A critically evaluate NCP question is near certain, and carrying both the official and audit numbers is what wins it. This question asked in 2020. So this is the regarding about NCAP. Its deadline 40% target due 2025-26, 51 by 100 cities, 23 hit, 197 Delhi highest. So NCAP question tested in 2020, WHO versus 2021, and comes to the 2026. The reform from city limits to airshed governance. Here is the single most important reform idea in air pollution. And the 2026 framing. NCAP is city based, but air does not respect city limits. Pollution generated in one district drifts into the next. The Indo-Gangetic plain functions as one connected airshed where Punjab's Stubble smoke becomes Delhi's winter crisis. So city by city plans are structurally inadequate. The reform is airshed based governance, managing air quality across the entire connected region, not one municipal boundary at a time. The Commission for Air Quality Management for the Delhi NCR region is a step toward exactly the regional approach. The Apex Committee under NCAP has recommended a regional action plan for Indo-Gangetic Plain states. So India's air pollution challenge requires airshed-based governance rather than city-specific emergency responses. Because the airshed, not the municipal boundary, it is the true unit of the problem. So that is why from reforms airshed, from city limits to airshed governance. So comes to the stubble burning. Stubble burning, the incentive, not the farmer. One subtopic demands the analytical reframe that separates a top answer. The lazy answer blames farmers for burning crop residue. The correct answer sees stubble burning as a symptom of disturbed incentives. Why does the farmer burn? A narrow window between the paddy harvest and the wheat sowing leaves no time to clear residue by hand. Machinery to manage residue is costly and unevenly available. Fragmented land holdings make investment uneconomic, and there is no market for the residue. So, burning is the cheapest exit. Behind it sits the deeper distortion, paddy procurement, and free power that lock Punjab and Haryana into growing a water intensive, residue heavy crop in the first place. The same incentive structure was met in Chapter 2's groundwater crisis. So the remedy is not to punish the farmer, but to fix the incentive, like excessive uses for residue, biomass pellets, bio CNG, creating a market that makes stubble worth more standing than burnt. So subsidized residue management machinery through cooperatives and upstream crop diversification away from the paddy itself. So crop residue burning is a symptom of distorted agriculture incentives, not merely a problem of farmer behavior. So naming the incentive, the sowing window, the absent residue market, the paddy lock-in is what lifts the answer from blame to analysis. This is airshed governance. This is stubble incentive, not the farmer. Narrow harvesting, costly machinery, deeper paddy requirement, and free power lock-in, and fix the incentive, etc. So we are moving to next segment, that is solid waste, plastics, and circular economy. The waste crisis in numbers. Turn from air to land, from what we breathe to what we bury. India's waste. India generates roughly 1.8 lakh tons of municipal waste per day, over 62 million tons a year. Only about 30 to 35% is scientifically segregated. The rest goes to dump sites, the garbage mountains, Catch fire, leach into groundwater, and emit methane. The core failure is captured in one phrase. That is, India has run a collect and dump model. The reform is to replace it with a circular economy where waste is not disposed of but recovered as a resource. That is the vocabulary shift for this whole segment from collect and dump to resource recovery. So, the waste hierarchy. What is the waste hierarchy? Fix the conceptual ladder because every waste answer should be built on it. The waste hierarchy ranks options from best to worst. First of all, prevention, then reduction, then reuse, then recycling, then recovery, then disposal. Prevention sits at the top. The waste never created is the cheapest to manage. Disposal, landfill, and incineration sits at the bottom, the last resort. The failure of Indian waste management is that it has operated upside down. Almost everything went straight to disposal, skipping prevention, reuse, and recycling entirely. The reform reverses the pyramid: prevent and recover first, then last dispose. So comes to the solid waste management rules 2026. This is most important for 2026 mains examination. Now the anchor development, freshly notified, and few will have it. The solid waste management rules 2026 were notified on 27th January 2026, effective 1st April 2026 under the Environment Protection Act, replacing the 2016 rules. They mark the decisive shift from collect and dump to a circular accountability based model. This should be the most probability question. SWM rules, Solid Waste Management Rules 2026. Four stream segregation at source, like what are they? Wet, dry, sanitary, and special care waste. With wet waste composted or biomethanated, dry waste sent to material recovery facilities, extended bulk waste generator responsibility, societies, malls, hotels, institutions, nearly 30% of waste made accountable for processing their own waste. Formal adoption of the waste hierarchy, mandatory energy recovery from high calorific waste, landfill restrictions, digital monitoring and traceability from generation to processing, polluter pays environmental compensation levied by the state pollution control boards. The critical evaluation move do not just to praise the rules. The 2016 rules also mandated segregation and failed. Success in 2026 will depend not on the regulation design but on municipal capacity, source segregation behavior, recycled markets, and the integration of waste pickers. The very thing, the very things the design alone cannot deliver. The implementation is need of the hour. The successes of the solid waste management rules 2026 will depend more on municipal capacity and behavior compliance than on regulatory design alone. India's waste crisis is an implementation problem, not a rule book problem. Impediments in disposing solid waste and safe removal of toxic waste. This question asked in 2018 10 marker. Then legal provisions for management of hazardous waste. This question asked in 2013 for 10 marker. So waste is overdue and the 2026 rules give a fresh current hook to a tested theme. So then we are moving to the next scene, that is plastic challenges and the EPR. Plastic is the sharpest edge of the waste crisis and it tests a specific instrument. India banned 12 categories of single use plastic from July 22 and raised the carry bag thickness threshold to 120 microns to make bags recyclable. but the ban's enforcement remains patchy. Alternatives are costlier and multi-layered packaging slips through. So the central instruments is extended producer responsibility. The central instrument is extended producer responsibility, EPR, which makes the producer responsible for the plastic's end of life, not the municipality or the consumer. EPR, the EPR portal has registered over 69,000 producers with roughly 308 lakh tons of waste processed and certified. But EPR's effectiveness depends on three things, that is traceability. First one, traceability. Traceability. Can you actually track the plastic to its producer? Then enforcement. Second one, enforcement are the obligations audited and penalized, and informal sector integration. Third one, depends on, here is, depends on traceability. First one, three things. Second one, enforcement. Third one, informal sector integration. So the waste pickers and kabadiwalas, who already do most of India's real recycling and must be built into the formal system, not displaced. Extended producer responsibility has considered potential in plastic waste management, but its effectiveness depends on traceability, enforcement, and the integration of the informal waste sector, without which it becomes a paper obligation. And the global frame, a worth line here is the global plastic treaty negotiations remain deadlocked. Producer nations resisting caps on production, vulnerable developing nations pushing for upstream limits, the same north-south fault line we saw in climate finance. So comes to the emerging waste streams, that is e-waste, microplastics, and pharma. So the waste segment with the three frontier streams. The ones UPSC is likely to test because they are new and underprepared. That is first one, e-waste. India generates roughly 2.2 million tons per year, yet more than half still flows through the informal sector. Unsafe acid leaching and open burning that poison workers and soil. The reform frame, not elimination of the informal sector, but its integration. Formalize the workers, apply EPR, enable urban mining to recover the critical minerals inside old devices, and legislate a right to repair to extend productive life. This is for e-waste. Then comes to microplastics. These expose the limit of a collect and dispose mindset. You cannot collect a particle already dispersed through water, soil, and the food chain. The answer is upstream, product redesign, textile and type standards, washing machine filters, wastewater treatment upgrades. Pharmacy comes to pharmaceutical waste. Microplastics is also important thing. Comes to pharmaceutical waste, unused medicines entering drains and landfills, dry water contamination, and antimicrobial resistance. A problem best framed through One Health, linking human, animal, and environmental health, addressed by take back systems and extended producer responsibility. So microplastic pollution demonstrates the limits of waste management approach focused only on collection and disposal. And once dispersed, the particle cannot be collected. So the solution must move upstream to redesign and prevention. So I'm going to close this chapter, the pollution and waste chapter, with recap on air, a four-dimensional crisis. The smog mechanism, nitrogen oxides plus volatile volatiles plus sunlight, NCAP, at its deadline, fair audited, progress lags, the official claim, the reform to airshed governance, and stubble burning reframed as an incentive problem, not a farmer problem. Comes to waste, a collect and dump model generating garbage mountains, the waste hierarchy inverted and now being righted, the SWM rules, solid waste management rules 2026 shifting to a circular accountability based system, extended producer responsibility for plastics only as strong as its traceability and informal sector integration, and the frontier systems, that is e-waste, microplastic, pharma waste, etc. And one vocabulary shift ran through of it, that is from control to circularity, from control to circularity, from disposal to resource recovery, from the city boundary to airshed. Comes to the spine, damage, lethal air, poison land, then governance failure, city bound plans, collect, collect and dump system, weak segregation and enforcement, remedy. What is the remedy? Remedy is important. Airshed governance, circular economy, producer responsibility, upstream prevention. So these are all things for chapter number 4. So then we are moving to next chapter 5, takes us to the living world. These pollutants threaten biodiversity, forests, and the communities who are conservation's oldest partners. So this is the end of the chapter number 4. That is, we fifth chapter we are going to take in another class.